Taking great action shots is one of the hardest things to master in photography. In this segment, I'm going to show you how to take better action shots. I'll also walk you through what you need to do to complete your motion assignment. Catching action is something that good equipment can really make a lot easier. Meet Zeus and Apollo. When they were kittens, I had a very nice bridge camera. I got great stills of them, but I just couldn't get good action shots. I'd either miss the picture because of shutter lag, or the photos would end up being blurry. And that's what made me buy a DSLR and progressively more expensive lenses. Usually I take still pictures of cats rather than video, and people always ask me, how is it that you always have your camera ready when they do crazy things? Well, the truth is, my cats aren't really outdoor cats. I've actually trained them to walk with me. It comes kind of naturally for rag dolls that like to follow. But I started doing it with them since they were kittens. Now I'm going to show you some of the antics they pull while on walks with me. It helps me get some great action photography. First tip for taking great action shots is to know your subject. If you can anticipate your subject's moves, cats disagree. If you can anticipate your subject's moves, you'll be able to have your camera ready when the action happens. Next tip is to use as fast a shutter speed as possible. In order to do that, you're going to need to open up your aperture so you can let in more light. Lenses with large apertures, lower f-stops, generally cost a lot more than other lenses. So this is where having expensive equipment can really come in handy. You'll notice I posted the settings on these shots. This picture was taken at 1/2000th of a second, so that's pretty fast shutter speed. I had my aperture wide open at f2.8, and then ISO was set at 1600. Again, a higher ISO will let us take a faster picture. So that brings us to our next tip. Use a higher ISO than you would use when taking a still shot. This shot used a fairly high ISO of 800. I don't like to go much above 1600 for ISOs, or you end up getting a lot of digital noise. But it's probably better to deal with some digital noise in post-processing than to miss the shot. When taking action shots, I often use shutter priority and set my ISO to automatic. Of course, nothing beats lots of bright natural light to help you get as high as possible shutter speed. There's also nothing like snow cover on the ground to reflect light and let you use a very high shutter speed. If we don't have enough natural light, we can use flash. Our on-camera flash will help freeze the action even at a slower shutter speed. The problem with on-camera flash, though, is that it won't allow you to take a picture at a very high shutter speed. On-camera flash synchronization is set to normally between 1/160th of a second to 1/250th of a second. If we want to be able to take a picture using flash at a higher shutter speed, we're going to need to buy a dedicated flash with a higher sync speed that'll fit into our camera's flash shoe. This picture was taken using a dedicated flash, and we see that we achieved a faster lens speed of 1/640th of a second. Don't forget to take advantage of modern technology and use your camera's continuous shooting mode to take photos as fast as possible. When the action starts, press the shutter release and don't let up until the action's over. For a motion project, we're supposed to take 3 shots. Our first shot's supposed to freeze the motion. Our second shot is supposed to show some motion blur. And our third shot is supposed to show our subject in focus while blurring our background. To show you some examples, let's check out our Rutgers assignment group. Andrew does a great job of freezing these surfers. And I really love Austin's shot. So let's take a closer look. I am wondering what happened next and whether he hurt himself. This is a great example of freezing somebody in midair. So I want to show you how to tell what settings were used to take any particular picture. So to check that out, we go down here to Additional Info. We click on Show More, and we see that Andrew used a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, aperture of f10, and an ISO of 640. Now let's look at a couple of very similar shots that use a different effect. Shun Chen took this picture of a waterfall, and if we look at this waterfall, we get some motion blur, but she's pretty much frozen the water and we can see the droplets. Okay, so let's go back and look at what settings she used. And we go down to Show More. And we see that she used a shutter speed of 1/119th of a second, and actually a very wide aperture of 2.2, but she probably took this on a bright sunny day. If we click on this again, we can see some more settings. We can see that she used automatic exposure. And basically when you use automatic exposure, your camera is going to want to take a sharp shot and use as fast as possible a shutter speed. So let's compare Shun's picture to this one taken by Sajid Harath. And you can see that the water has a very different look to it. You can see that we have a lot of motion blur, which has kind of softened the look of the water. So let's look at the settings that Sajid used. So to take this picture, Sajid used a shutter speed of 1/6 of a second. And that's actually quite a slow shutter speed. So that he could achieve a slow shutter speed, he stopped down his camera's aperture and used a relatively high f-stop of f16. And you can see his ISO was 320. Okay, let's look at his other settings. So we can see that Sajid knew what he was doing and used aperture priority mode so that he could take control of his camera and get the effect that he wanted to get. So Sajid's picture is a good example of motion blur. Now I'm going to show you some photos that I took when I did a similar motion project. Since I did my project in winter and work every day, I wanted something that I could control. So I bought a couple of bouncing balls at Walmart. Okay, in this picture I freeze the action, and let's look at how I did it. For freezing the motion, I used a shutter speed that was kind of on the slow side, 1/320th of a second, and an aperture of f3.5. I cranked up my ISO so I could get a little higher shutter speed. But I also used another trick. When we go through and look at my data, we see that I use flash. Now, I was actually using a dedicated flash unit so that I could get this higher flash sync speed. This is my motion blur shot. The balls actually lit up when they bounced, so I knew I could get a really cool picture if I shot in the dark. So let's see what I did for this exposure. Here I used a shutter speed of 1 full second. So we got to see the motion as the ball bounced and left some light trails to give us a really cool effect. Getting a sharp image with background blur is probably going to be the hardest shot that you do. And it takes a lot of practice. You have to pan your subject and try to keep your camera steady so that you get a nice sharp subject. And with this one, we've got some motion blur around the outside, which had to happen because the ball was rolling. But at least our center is nice and sharp. And we can see that our background's fairly blurry. This is kind of a tricky shot to get. And I'll admit that I probably took 100 or 200 shots to get this one usable one. So let's look at our settings on this one. Okay, I used a shutter speed of 1/20th of a second, aperture of f8, ISO of 200. I'd probably try a little higher shutter speed, probably somewhere between 1/60th of a second and 1/125th of a second. But this is a shot you're going to have to fool around with. Take lots of them and maybe you'll get one good one.